Welcome back to Men and the City. In today's video, we're going to talk about the sexual marketplace, and I'm doing so from an appropriate location to do so, Cartagena, Colombia, where sex is currency and commoditized, and that factors into the discussion today. So today's video is going to be called Dating Generations. Can the dating marketplace be fixed? Now, I want to preface what I'm going to say in this video by saying a couple things. The first is that I know it is very trendy and it is pervasive in the Manosphere, on the internet, and YouTube, Instagram, etc., to more or less proclaim the death of average men in the dating marketplace. Now, I do not feel that that is the case, and I said that to you at the beginning because we are on a continuum of emotional despair, you might say. A lot of guys on YouTube in particular, they don't want to hear about solutions. They don't want to hear about how the present moment, which is very tumultuous for the majority of men, young men today, they don't really want to hear about how that can change because they're stuck in a very negative feedback loop. And I certainly understand that. But logically speaking, based on my travels, based on the worldview that I convey on this channel, I do not think that the situation for average men is hopeless, nor do I think that the dating marketplace is not going to reset in a favorable way. I think that's exactly what is happening. So that's what we're going to talk about today. That being said, there has been collateral damage, and there will continue to be collateral damage as a transformation occurs in the sexual marketplace. But it is not one that spells doom and gloom for average men. There's a fairly entertaining interview that was done recently with a guy named Tom Dillon. Now, Tom Dillon is a comedian, says a lot of interesting things, but more than anything, he's a social commentator. And he basically broke the last 4 generations down according to the following framework. He said that the baby boomer generation was blue-pilled, the Gen X generation that succeeded them was purple-pilled, millennials have been red-pilled, and the Zoomer generation, the youngest generation, so these are the folks that are born more or less after 2000, are the black-pilled generation. Now, I start with that point of view because to contextualize where we are today is very important. Furthermore, it's important to recognize that dating, like everything else, is a cycle, and it's a cycle that responds positively, negatively, and otherwise to broader social cycles that are at play. The economy factors into this. Power dynamics in the world factor into this, all right? It is not something that's happening in a vacuum. And I know that might sound a bit strange, right? Why would it matter, who's president of a country or what the general social ethos is? Does that really change the nature of men and women? Well, it's not so much that it changes it, but it does amplify or it does shift those dynamics in certain ways. And that's crucial to understand as we get into this. The baby boomer generation is crucial to understand how we got where we got. The baby boomers, as Tom Dillon correctly said in his interview, never really experienced trauma. They didn't have a major war. They didn't really experience a lot of the upheaval, economically or otherwise, that the other generations that I mentioned have. And that leaves them with a very naive outlook. Now, this video is not designed to condemn baby boomers, but it is to help contextualize and help them understand the tremendous social changes set in motion that they didn't really have to deal with. And of course, I'm talking about the sexual liberation in the 1960s, but I'm also talking about the general decline of Western countries, chief among them the United States. It happened under their watch. Now, it wasn't all their fault necessarily, but a lot of the ideas that were set in motion when they came of age, that they didn't necessarily have to deal with, we are now experiencing today. And for the purposes of the dating marketplace, the sexual liberation factors in prominently in that discussion. So basically, the baby boomers enjoyed the stability and the self-confidence, the ethos of a country that was radically different than it is today. Most of them had 2 parents. Most of them were able to pair bond. Most of them had a fairly stable career. They had defined income and a structured social system for most of their lives. It's true that there was upheaval in the 60s. It's true that Vietnam and Korea, that the end of the Cold War were key moments in their lives. But for the most part, the social fabric was still more or less intact, less so for the succeeding generations. And that explains to a large extent why the baby boomers somehow do not process some of the destruction and the turbulence that so many generations that have come after them have experienced. The Gen Xers experienced a little bit of this turmoil, but for the most part, they were able to get a job, they were able to marry, they were able to settle into a long-term social structure as well. The change really comes about with the Millennial and the Zoomer generation. The Millennial generation was disrupted fundamentally by the economic crisis in 2008. As we know, many of the folks born after 1980 and before 2000 have had a very difficult time getting stable jobs, pair bonding, procuring long-term relationships, meeting people that were invested in their lives over the long run. And so even though millennials have embraced very destructive ideas like wokeism or microaggressions or fallen into the social media trap, you might say, that began with online dating in the 2000s, which is really when it took off. Even though that's the case, we have seen how those social changes have failed. We have been disillusioned by the institutions. We have experienced the cognitive dissonance from leadership, okay? And that has been a red-pilling process. I don't think there's any demographic that's been more red-pilled, you might say, than millennial women, a very high percentage of whom are single, unmarried, and do not have any children. That in and of itself demonstrates the failure of the social changes set in motion in the 1960s. And I don't need to belabor them because most of you know them. However, that red-pilling process has actually been very good because the disillusionment born of experience, born of the toxicity in the dating marketplace and the hostility between and among the genders has awakened a broader social consciousness. And so part of what Tom Dillon said in his interview, which I think is completely accurate, is that the Zoomer generation in particular senses the social dislocation and damage that the preceding generation has experienced, namely the millennial generation. And so on that basis, their behavior is beginning to change. Now, to be very specific about what I mean, online dating, it seems, peaked somewhere around 2020, meaning most folks, or the majority of couples, it seems, until very recently, has met online. And the explosion of online dating really started in 2010 and has lasted, it seems, about a decade or more. Now, I am not saying that online dating is finished, that it's over. What I am saying is that it has peaked. And that is a proxy for a broader awakening and social change that I believe is afoot. Now, the question is, why has that happened? Well, according to recent surveys conducted by Axios and other groups, something like 80% of Gen Z doesn't even use online dating apps. And I do think that the reality of online dating, the failure of the mechanism that was supposed to pair bond more efficiently, has also resonated strongly with the millennial generation, who I think collectively is beginning to divest from online dating as well. Now, this discussion is not exclusively centered on online dating, but we know that social media has done tremendous damage to the sexual marketplace because it's created a distortion field in which female selection has been very narrowly defined and therefore excluded the majority of men. But this has not worked to the benefit of men or women who, as I said a moment ago, are ending up single, without children, and unhappy on that basis. That being said, this damage that's been done and the economic turbulence, the social upheaval, the disillusionment with institutions, etc., has provoked backlash, an awakening that's been painful, to be sure. And it seems the millennial generation is really at the cutting edge of that awakening. And this is the black pill conclusion, you might say, for men and women that are about my age, on the older edge or the leading edge of the millennial generation. And that is to say that the majority of us will likely never marry or have kids, the majority. Even those who do will probably raise their children, will probably have long-term relationships that are toxic or defective in some critical way. But I think that's going to be less the case for the younger millennials and Generation Z, the Zoomers. And the reason is because there is a categorical, I think, rejection that's underway of the materialist culture, the online dating solipsism, the gorge of sexual indulgence that has come to define the sexual marketplace today. In other words, I think that online dating, that this materialist gorge, this sexual promiscuity that's saturated Western culture in particular, I think it's flaming out. I think it's burning itself out. But it's going to take more or less a decade for the wounds, for the scar tissue, for the residue of the damage set in motion in the 1960s to heal. Now, what does that healing process look like? What does the convalescence of a dating marketplace look like? Well, it looks very close to what we're experiencing today. Lots of men and women that are simply rejecting the dating marketplace altogether, that are walking away from it because it's so systemically toxic, because they can't find anybody that's quality or shares their level of investment. And like I said, this is really centered on the older millennials, right? I don't think the millennials categorically are all doomed necessarily, but I do think that folks my age, maybe 30 to 40, it's very unlikely that we're going to have stable families, a stable social structure, you might say, to raise children. But the Zoomers, as I said, are in the process of rejecting the toxicity and the sugar high of online dating. And the reason for this, folks, is very simple. Human beings are spiritual beings. As I've said before, it's not a revelation. And so ultimately, what's bad for your soul, what's bad for your spirit, just like what's bad for your body, is going to provoke, or rather, it's going to cause problems. It's going to ruin your body or your health or your psyche, right? The process of switching from one partner to another partner to another partner is a despiritualizing experience. And so society is beginning to process the damage that's been done to it. And that will set the stage for the convalescence that I'm hinting at. But I think it's going to take about 10 years. And you're going to see, similar to the past, a new social ethos, a neo-masculinity, a new way of interacting with the opposite gender. But both genders have an investment in each other. Both genders, fundamentally speaking, want the same thing. They want a pair bond, they want to have children, they want to have families, and prepare the next generation to do it all over again. The last two generations, the millennial generation and the Zoomer generation, have borne the brunt of some very defective social trends set in motion in the 1960s. But we're at the end of that cycle. And so a healing process has begun. But between now and then, what we must do, the older millennials, is help facilitate that awakening. What do I mean by that? Well, it seems that our mission is reform. It seems that our mission is to not simply reject the dating marketplace, for instance, or to reject tolerating some of this ridiculous female behavior, this unchecked hypergamy is more or less what I call it. This shameful promiscuity, this wealth porn that defines pop culture today. It's not simply that we must individually reject that. It's also that we need to look out for the succeeding generation that comes after us, to set a standard, if you will, for the Zoomers so that they have a chance at a more functional and stable life and will marry and have children and so forth and so on. And so part of neo-masculinity, part of what my channel is all about, is embracing a new ethos, not rejecting some of these red pill conclusions that we've come to, accepting them, operationalizing them, and preparing the succeeding generation accordingly so that they can have stable, functional families. What does this mean in an operational sense? Well, it means new marriage laws. It means a political revolution. It means a social intolerance, right? A rejection of this narcissistic, self-aggrandizing, overindulgent culture, right? We are the generation that must pave the way for the Zoomers so that they can have a more stable, more functional, more sustainable social life and experience. And I think that process is happening as we speak. This video is part of it. A lot of these angry men, the Sexless Men Revolt, that is part of this as well. They're revolting not to destroy, but to reform. And so the dating marketplace is going to fix itself in a sense, but we have to be active participants in that process. We have to demonstrate that this kind of behavior that is rampant in our society is unacceptable to us, and by extension, as a collective, as a group, we won't tolerate it anymore. We have to draw a line in the sand. We have to, in a sense, embrace a sexual prohibitionism, and I think that's coming. I do. Because there's a broader recognition that using people sexually, whether you're a man or a woman, it's not ideal, is it? It's not good for the man, it's not good for the woman, it's not good for society in general. We don't want to commoditize sex the way that it is in other parts of the world. Now, to some degree, on margin, sex is always commoditized. There's always a transaction that happens. But it must be tempered, it must be contextualized within a broader social structure that provides guardrails, right? What I mean by that is we need to embrace family values. We need to embrace traditional values, but we need to push for reform that's consistent with those values. We need to bring back shame. And men that are going MGTOW, this revolt of sexless men, as I call it, they are imposing those social sanctions. They're beginning to hold women accountable. Sometimes it's done in a very horrifying way. You see these shows like Fresh and Fit where they sit there and they sort of humiliate these women. And I don't recommend going about it like that. But what they are doing is they're beginning to reimpose social standards in the process. And that is how the dating marketplace is fixed. And so when I date, when you date, we need to think about the standard that we set for the younger generations. And certainly Gen Z, you're doing the same thing, right? Because people are going to come after you. And I think that awareness is growing. I really do. I see evidence for it everywhere. I saw an interesting comment in one of my channels, or one of my videos rather, that more or less was a guy who said, look, I'm a Chad, I'm an alpha, I have lots of girlfriends, but I've stopped doing that because I recognize that the short-term casual relationships that I have are destructive, not just to me, but they damage the woman and it causes a ripple effect. It damages her future prospects and therefore the future prospects of other men. That is exactly the right mentality. It's not just about us, it's about the collective. It's not just about us, it's about the society. It's not just about our family, it's about families in general. And that broader thinking is coming to the forefront, in my opinion. And that is what is ultimately going to reset the dating marketplace. Because women and men, yes, we have instincts. Yes, we have sexual desire and libido. But we're also spiritual beings. And so we've got to blend those two things together in a new paradigm. And that new paradigm is materializing as we speak. And part of that is this backlash against unchecked hypergamy, against a kind of female promiscuity and recklessness from a tiny number of men that's unacceptable, that's irresponsible, that has set in motion some very destructive social consequences that we're only now just beginning to understand. So, the baby boomer generation was blue-pilled. The Gen X generation was purple-pilled. The millennials are red-pilled, and it appears as though the Zoomers are black-pilled. But as faith in the old institutions and the old ways collapses, as the materialist order or age collapses, as I call it, it's paving the way for a new ethos, and that new ethos will be more congruent, not less, with the traditional values and faith that has held civilization together for a long time. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been through this before. Especially in the United States, there have been great awakenings. There have been social gospel movements, the temperance movement, the prohibition movement. We are on the leading edge of yet another kind of sexual prohibitionism that's going to reset and rebalance the dating marketplace. And we're all a part of it. And so it is incumbent on us in the actions in our daily lives, to reset the system. Specifically, those of us who are at the older edge of the millennial generation. And that will enable a more prosperous and stable society going forward. One in which the relationship between the genders is rebalanced and stable once again. So, stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.